Hi, students. We are moving on to learn about the evolution of plants. Um, Plants, if you recall, I've said this, that remember we talked about protists. Protists were this kingdom, because we have the kingdom protist, the kingdom plant, animal, and fungi. So protist was this kingdom of organisms that didn't fit into other ones. But if you remember, they had like protozoans, the precursors to animals, and then there were algae in the protists, which are single and multicellular photosynthetic aquatic organisms. And so biologists believe that green algae, which were protists, but eukaryotic, moved on to like the area between water and land, and from there evolved, acquired adaptations to survive on land. And so what we're going to learn about are how the four groups of plants kind of acquired better and better adaptations to survive on land and were able to conquer all parts of land. Okay, and so why would they move from the water to land, right? Well, organisms are always looking for their own niche, their own area where they can better survive and reproduce. So one thing is there was less competition on land because all the aquatic organisms were in the water. Actually, the light, because they're photosynthetic, light is more abundant on land than in the water because the water disrupts some of the absorption of light. So there's more potential for photosynthesis. And if you recall, photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide, and there was more carbon dioxide available in the air on land than through the water. So those were some advantages, that encouraged this evolution onto land. There was also some disadvantages for algae to move onto land, They are going from an area that's aquatic, so they have no issues with dehydration or absorbing water. So one disadvantage is lack of plentiful water, and now they're going to dry out. Water also holds the algae, the multicellular algae, if you think like kelp, it holds them upright. But on land, they need something to hold them upright. Like we have skeletons that hold us up. Plants need something. And reproduction was more difficult because on water, the gametes, everything can swim to the egg, the sperm can swim to the egg, but on land, they can't do that. So hopefully this type of image looks familiar to you. Think of our candy lab. This is a phylogenetic tree. And so this is showing you, this is the most ancient, because if you think of time, millions of years ago on your X, what was present 500 million years ago was, remember, we saw this actually on the microscope. This would be a protist, a multicellular protist, Chara. We looked at it. It was the bigger one that you even didn't have to look on high magnification. That's a multicellular green algae protist. And that's what is believed to be the closest ancestor to, on your right here, all the groups of land plants. So green algae made its way to land. Think of what were the advantages. We just discussed those. And slowly evolved adaptations to better survive on land. Okay. We're going to put in here, remember, we put in the derived traits, the traits that, so if we put a trait here, all the organisms have them. So first, when the the algae went from water to land, the risk of dehydration was pretty big. And so plants have a waxy cuticle, and this was one of the first derived characters to evolve, So it's a wax over their photosynthetic material that prevents water from dehydrating, from evaporating out. There was also other derived characters that we're not going to get into. And then the first, most ancient group of plants, that had this waxy cuticle are called the bryophytes. So these are classified as non-vascular. We're going to learn what vascular tissue is later. But the bryophytes, the ones you may be familiar with, are like mosses. Okay? They're very basic. They don't grow upright. They actually have to be in a very, where do you find it? In like shady areas, the understory. They have to live in pretty moist environments. They don't have vascular tissue. They can't grow upright. But they are able and still do survive on land. From there, plants evolved what are called vascular tissue, right? Which is the tissue, it's like the organ for a plant that transports water from the roots up the plant. Vascular tissue also has very rigid cell walls that allow plants to grow upright. So it's like their skeleton and their transport. And it also transports sugars from where they photosynthesize to other parts of the body. So the plants that had the first vascular tissue, the ones you probably know of are like the ferns, right? Ferns can grow a little more upright. They're called the pteridophytes. From there, so all of these have vascular tissue. Seeds evolved. So a seed houses the little embryo, right? It houses the embryo so that it's protected. Seeds also have food for the growing embryo so it can grow before it actually can photosynthesize. And seeds were a huge adaptation that allowed for better reproduction. And think of the pine trees, you know, those cones have like the seeds inside. And that was a very large adaptation that evolved. So the gymnosperms are like those pine trees that you know of. And then there was the flowering plants that have now not just seeds, but also flowers to help with their reproduction. We're going to talk about how flowers help. And that's the last group is the flowering angiosperms. So these are the 4 groups that you're going to have to be familiar with. These derived traits show what everything after had. So after the evolution of the green algae to these first group, waxy cuticle, all of these have a waxy cuticle, right? Remember we learned that with when we made our phylogenetic tree. Then vascular tissue evolved, so all of these are vascular plants. Okay, so the non-vascular plants, remember those were the bryophytes, the first group. They're very small, they can't grow upright. They don't even have true roots, stems, or leaves. They absorb through light. They don't have leaves, so it's their actual body that's the photosynthetic pigment. Mosses are ones you probably are familiar with that grow on rocks. There's also these called liverworts or hornworts. So those are the most primitive, simplest type of plant, right? Those are the bryophytes. So what evolved after that? Vascular tissue. How did that help plants? It allowed them to grow more upright. It allowed them to transport water up the plant, all right, so they could move further away from a water source because now they also have roots. So all the groups after vascular tissue, the derived character, have it. So ferns, the pteridophytes, the gymnosperms, the angiosperms, they all have vascular tissue. So sometimes we call vascular tissue like a circulatory system for plants because it transports water and it transports nutrients, it transports sugars. The xylem is the type of vascular tissue that transports water, and the phloem transports sugar. Xylem usually goes just from the root up to the leaves. Phloem will go in any direction depending on where sugar is needed. The first group of vascular plants were those pteridophytes, those ferns. They didn't have seeds, right? So now the reproductive structures, which are found in the sori, the little, if you've ever looked at a fern underneath the little bumps, the gametes have to actually be transported through water. So ferns are kind of restricted to areas that are very moist. They do have roots, they do have leaves that for ferns are called fronds, and they produce spores in the sori, which are underneath the lamb. That's where the reproductive cells are produced. Then we go to the vascular seeded plants. The first ones are those gymnosperms, like the pines. Sometimes we call these conifers. They're cone bearers. Their seeds give a chance to reproduce more successfully. Inside the seed is the little baby plant, the embryo. So the seed contains nutrients for this embryo that allows it to grow before it actually has to start photosynthesizing. Leaves are actually the needles. They have a lot of cuticle, a lot of that waxy coating to protect them. And they also have vascular tissue. So now these can really grow upright. From there, the evolution of flowers occurred. So flowering plants, right? Pine trees don't have flowers. Now flowers are a huge adaptation. How is that beneficial? The flower attracts what we call a pollinator. So a pollinator, you may think of as a bee, it transports the male reproductive cell to the female reproductive cell for reproduction. So now it's like the plants, by having a flower, have help in reproducing. We're going to do a flower dissection in lab, but angiosperms are the flowering plants. They're the most successful land plants because they're using animals, or sometimes flowers are pollinated by wind. Think of a dandelion, or think of that's seeding by wind. But pollination can happen by wind too, not just animal, but it's usually still in a flower that helps them. And angiosperms also have fruit. So the flower aids with joining the male reproductive cell to the female, the egg and the sperm, right? That's what the flower does. After those two have joined, it usually occurs in an ovary of the flower. It forms the seed that contains the embryo. The fruit grows around the seed and aids in seed dispersal. So seed dispersal happens after pollination. Seed dispersal is to get the seed far away from the parent plant so that it can be there's a better chance of it surviving if it can grow all over, not just right by the parent plant. So the fruit helps in seed dispersal because it attracts an animal to eat the fruit and transport it somewhere far where the animal doesn't digest the seed, poops it out, and then the plant grows somewhere else. So in summary, plants evolved from green algae, the protists, the multicellular green algae, the chara that we saw. First to evolve were those non-vascular mosses that didn't have roots, didn't have leaves, didn't have vascular tissue, right? They had cuticle. So they're successful, they still survive, they're still here today, but we don't find them everywhere, right? They're limited to places that aren't very sunny, that have moisture. Then the vascular tissue evolved, and that vascular tissue allowed for plants to grow more upright because it provides strength and support. It also allows water to be transferred from in the ground up to the plant, so the plant doesn't have to be surrounded by water. It also helps transport sugars to all parts so it can grow better. After the vascular tissue evolved, all the groups from that point on had vascular tissue. Then seeds evolved. How did seeds help? Seeds contain the embryo and protect the embryo from harsh environments, provide nourishment for the embryo so the seed can germinate or grow when the conditions are right. Both gymnosperms and angiosperms have seeds, but only angiosperms have flowers, right? Those are the dominant group on land today. The flower helps with actual reproduction, and the flower attracts pollinators, and then the flower also, parts of it form into the fruit after pollination. The fruit houses the seed that helps in seed dispersal. Now, we didn't go into something in plants called alternation of generations, and this is something kind of a difficult concept, but it's the idea that the most primitive plants have what we call two generations, and one is diploid and one is haploid. So the mosses you see on the ground that you see are actually the haploid generation. So our haploids are like our eggs and our sperm, and that was dominant. And then the part that releases the little spores are actually the diploid. So like our body is diploid, but in mosses, the diploid is just the tiny, tiny spore. So in a way, as plants evolved, those two generations, the haploid and the diploid, became more and more like humans, where the dominant plant you see, like for an angiosperm, is actually the diploid generation. And that's one thing we didn't get into a lot of detail about, but I just wanted to make you aware. Take care, everyone.